of observability that I like, which I give total credit to Hazel Weekly because she came up with this definition, and it's the ability to ask meaningful questions, get useful answers, and then act upon what you've learned. The reality is observability is a team sport. It has to be practiced by everyone in the organization. The argument that I will make for an observability team, I would see it as more of like an observability practices team or a center of excellence, as some people may call it, where there's got to be some oversight as far as observability practices go, right? It can't be a free-for-all. We need to save developers from themselves because we like to do what we like to do.
This is Solving for Change, the podcast where you hear stories from business leaders and technology industry experts about how they executed bold business transformations in response to shifts in the market or advances in technology. In every episode, we'll explore real-world strategies that fuel successful evolution. I'm your host this month, Marc LeBlanc. I'm excited today to welcome Adriana from Dynatrace. She's a principal developer advocate. Thanks for joining us in Solving for Change today, Adriana.
Thanks for having me.
So we wanted to have an episode talking about observability and how it fits into the challenges of today and the future. Maybe just before we get into some of those conversations, can you explain to me a little bit about what does your role entail? How do you get engaged? And what is it you're trying to help customers with?
So my role is, as a developer advocate, I bridge the gap between end users and engineers within the organization to make sure that we get that feedback from the end users back to the org. But also, my area of focus is observability. So part of my job is to really educate folks on observability practices, what it's all about. I'm heavily engaged in the OpenTelemetry community, and OpenTelemetry, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's basically an open source framework for instrumenting your application, and it's the intent is that it's vendor neutral. So the idea is most of the major observability vendors out there, including Dynatrace, can ingest OpenTelemetry data, so everyone's ingesting the same data, and really what differentiates things is what is being done with the data to make it useful to you.
Very interesting. I'm wondering, thinking about your experience, do you have one moment you can share where a customer or an organization had that aha moment and they saw observability just click?
I think the aha moment is when your code is instrumented and you're like, oh my God, all of a sudden I can see what's actually happening in my system. I can even speak for myself, like for me, like distributed tracing is kind of, I would say, the backbone of observability, and being able to see a distributed trace of your service calls, like from start to finish. Like I click a button on my application to like add something to my shopping cart, and then it gets added, and seeing what that looks like from start to finish, I think is the real aha moment, and being able to, get those insights from your application. That's I think what hooks people on observability.
I agree. And let's break that down a little bit, because I think, if you put on the hat of a business owner or an organization and they're thinking about their applications, they're just thinking about time to market. They're thinking about functionality. How do I get in front of my customer? What goal is, as a developer advocate, or even just someone that represents observability, what is it you're trying to bring to the table? Because that could sometimes maybe be seen as a gate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and here's the trick, right? It's often hard, especially if like your application code isn't instrumented, or maybe it's using some other old type of like vendor specific instrumentation. If you're saying like, hey, you need to instrument your code now, you're basically introducing new technical debt into your code, right? Because it's something that you didn't have before. And so you're introducing that new technical debt. It's new code, new bugs, right? It's as simple as adding a log message that can still introduce a bug into your code. So there's that. There's the learning curve, especially the industry is shifting towards OpenTelemetry. So that means having to learn how to instrument your code using OpenTelemetry. And that's something that can be a little bit scary. There is a bit of a learning curve to OpenTelemetry. I think the folks in OTel are working really hard to help bridge that gap, but it's still there. So then there's that scare factor, right? The, oh my God, I have to like learn this new stuff. I don't have time. Many organizations are faced with the reality that they might have some stuff that is, constantly on fire. And so you're saying, my house is on fire, but you want me to instrument my code, but I have to put out the fire. But and that's where you kind of have that contradiction, right? Because if you don't instrument your code, you won't have those greater insights into your application. So you have to take the time to sit down and instrument your application to like put an end to those fires that are happening. So I think that's probably the hardest sell. And there's also the cultural aspect. People are used to doing things the way that they want to do. That they want to do it, right? Because they've been doing it for years and years and years. I was at an organization where, one of the senior leaders was like, well, we're going to do it this, and this way because it worked at my previous organization 5 years ago. Well, guess what? Technology has changed drastically 5 years ago, and what worked for that organization 5 years ago just isn't going to work for your organization now.
Yeah, you hit on a couple of things I think are worth doing a double click on. One was, okay, if we don't get started with observability, the house may already be on fire. We just don't know. So we got to take the time to fix it. And then the other element I'd like to double click on after is just around the culture of that. So double clicking in onto, maybe your house is on fire and we need to take the time. When an organization decides, yes, we're going to do this, we're going to get better insights, better observability into our platform and our applications, how do they get started?
So there are a few things that you can do. One thing that really lowers the barrier to entry is if you're instrumenting your code with OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry has this functionality called auto instrumentation or zero code instrumentation. Now, it's not available for all languages, but it's kind of the biggies that we see a lot, like Java, .NET, Python, I'm going to say PHP and Go, I think are kind of the main 5 ones for which this is available. Now, as the name implies, zero code instrumentation means you do not have to touch your code to instrument it, to be able to instrument it. So you usually wrap it around, use an agent to wrap around your code, and so it'll instrument basically any sort of popular common libraries that your code uses. It'll inject that instrumentation for you. So that lowers the barrier to entry a fair bit. So that's one way to start. Another thing to do is basically, get in the habit of instrumenting as you code. So we're not saying like go back to your old legacy code and instrument it bit by bit. I mean, eventually it would be kind of nice to do that. But you know what? To not get overwhelmed, just start instrumenting any of your new code. So then that puts you into that habit of instrumentation, and hopefully it turns into muscle memory in the same way that, we've got test-driven development and we get into the habits of writing our unit tests as we code. Let's get into the habit of writing our instrumentation as we code. And that's actually known as observability-driven development. And then the final piece of advice that I would give around instrumentation is any homegrown libraries or frameworks that you have in your organization, look at instrumenting those as well, because chances are most of your code will touch that. So you end up with a huge win by just doing that. So these, I would say, are some ways to get started. I would add a couple of cautions because this is something I've seen out in the field, which is basically it's very tempting when an organization decides to instrument their code with OpenTelemetry or whatever for that matter, to basically say, hey, my developers don't have time to instrument the code. Let's get another team to do it. And they'll often try to tap an observability team to do that. And I can speak from experience because I was running an observability practices team at one organization, and leadership wanted us to do that and to create dashboards. And the problem with doing that is we are not familiar with your code. So you're basically asking us the equivalent of like, write comments for my code. Well, I don't know what your code does. similar to the dashboards, like I don't know what's important to you for dashboarding, so don't ask me to do that. So you really have to invest that time to do the instrumentation to learn it. So, I mean, these will definitely make it better and less overwhelming, but at the end of the day, you still have to invest the time for instrumentation to learn it.
That's really interesting, and I really want to get into that. But I want to keep going on the how do you get started. We talked a little bit just now around, instrumenting your code for your application layer. Talk to me as we go up the stack a little bit, because I think there's two more elements. I think, and maybe this is an observability versus modern conversation, but what about the platform layer? And then what about that user experience layer? Because at the end of the day, the company or your customer really cares, can I do the thing the application promises I can do? So how does observability fit into there? Are there different considerations, or is there a different thought pattern?
I mean, I guess at the end of the day, you want to, you still, it's not just about the application instrumentation, right? You do absolutely want to instrument your infrastructure. You want to instrument your front end and your back end, right? Because you want to gain those insights. And there's a couple of interesting things that have cropped up recently, because I think like OpenTelemetry, for example, when it was initially started, I think there was a lot of emphasis put in on instrumenting for the back end, right? But as we know, front end is equally important. And so now there's a lot of attention shifting over to, not shifting, but there's more love being given to the front end of things, and even to like mobile observability, because let's face it, a lot of the time we interact with the interwebs through our mobile phones. So having that kind of, having observability into our mobile applications is super important, but also the infrastructure observability. So it's still equally important to, capture your infrastructure metrics and your infrastructure logs, and have that be part of your overall observability story. So we can't just say, oh, it's just the application. Well, the application runs somewhere, so we have to care also about the stuff that's running our application.
And then, maybe just an opinion, or if you have some concrete experience, all this instrumentation, how are the senior leadership of these companies, how are they ingesting that? How is that information getting to them? Is that a dashboard? Is it something different?
Yeah, I would say for senior leadership, you probably want it in the form of a dashboard, something digestible, something, easy to understand that they can glance at. I don't feel that most dashboards are tailored at senior leaders. Definitely you don't want, actually, let me rephrase. I think the dashboards that your SREs will use are probably not the same dashboards that you want your senior leaders to look at. I also think, and this goes into an interesting realm, which is, bringing observability outside of that traditional realm of technology and into other aspects of how a business operates, right? So basically being able to relate business events even to make those business events observable, make our internal business workflows observable. And that is going to look, I would say, probably a little bit different than what you would use for, say, like your application observability or your infrastructure observability.
Let's switch gears. I want to dig into the cultural aspects, as you touched on a couple of things that really resonate with me. And if I kind of pull together everything that you said, I'm really hearing that observability is not a siloed sport. You don't have an observability team. You don't, you hear this in other disciplines as well. You don't have a DevOps team. That's a great way to set your DevOps folks for failure. Maybe just unpack that a little bit, what you mean when, why is there risk in hiring just an observability team?
Yeah, I think you explained it perfectly. Like it basically silos your whole observability operation, right? You run the risk of isolating observability as just another pillar in your organization. And the reality is observability is a team sport. It has to be practiced by everyone in the organization, because when you think about it, the developers are the ones who are going to instrument the code. But then guess what? So the developers can leverage their own instrumented code to troubleshoot their code. But also when that code gets handed off to QA, the QAs can go and analyze the data in whatever observability tool that you have and tell the developers, when they're running their exploratory tests or what have you, if they find the bug, they can use the instrumented data to go back to developers and say, hey, I found a bug and here's what I think the problem is because you've instrumented that code. Or if they find a bug but they're not sure what's going on, that's another opportunity to go back to developers and say, I found a bug. I don't know what the problem is. Maybe you're missing instrumentation. So instrumentation becomes a quality gate. And then by the time it's handed over for production, then at that point, SREs are hopefully equipped with enough information to be able to do their troubleshooting during production incidents. But also the instrumented data assists them because some of the instrumentation that you're doing is metrics, and SREs rely on metrics to create SLIs and in turn SLOs. So they use that to basically inform the creation of these two things. But on top of that, and I think this is where you have like observability superpower is, and especially OpenTelemetry enables this, is that correlation of your data, right? So your metrics and your traces and your logs are correlated. So, when an SLO is breached, you can go back to the underlying SLI. Well, that underlying SLI is tied to a metric. That metric is tied to a trace. And then we can like start to dig deep and kind of understand what the underlying root cause is. So now we have this connection from development all the way to production. And there's no way that you can have like imagine if you had an observability team, instrumenting your code separately, like that would make no sense. Now, the argument that I will make for an observability team, I would see it as more of like an observability practices team or a center of excellence, as some people may call it, where there's got to be some oversight as far as observability practices go, right? It can't be a free for all. We need to save developers from themselves because we like to do what we like to do. And so an observability practices team would basically put in a set of guidelines, and they would be, the experts on instrumentation and what are the new things that are out and about and what are kind of the best ways to configure and deploy your OTel collectors, for example. But the implementation would be left up to like these teams that are specializing in the various aspects, right? The developers for instrumenting code and like your platform engineering team or what have you for managing your OTel collectors. But having that oversight, ensuring that you don't end up with like a tools free for all, that's another thing. Because oftentimes you get into some organizations where they're like, well, this is the organization's tool for observability. But then there's like some random rogue team that's like, and we're running our own, homegrown observability stack in Bob's desktop under his desk. And, so having that kind of oversight, I think it allows for standardization. It allows for collaboration. I don't think your observability practices team should operate in as a standalone pillar either. It has to have like input from those other teams because otherwise we're doomed to turn it into kind of like a little kingdom. And I think that's where things start to unravel for many organizations is with the little kingdoms.
Yeah. Again, just picking up on things you're saying as we go through this, and I don't think it's a new term, but you touched on your platform engineering teams, and you also touched on standardization. How do you see that evolving? How has that evolved over maybe the last, say, 5 or 6 years? Because I do believe that with more conversations around platform engineering, what that kind of a team can provide, we are seeing standardization. So what has that meant for observability?
I think for observability and specifically around open telemetry, that would be standardization around how you deploy like your open telemetry collectors, for example. And for those who aren't familiar, the OTel collectors, it's basically a vendor neutral agent that it's essentially a data pipeline. It ingests your telemetry data from multiple sources, and it can be from applications, from infrastructure, etc. It processes the data, so it can massage it, add, remove attributes, do data masking, which prevents that PII data from getting out there, and then sends it to a backend for storage and analysis. And so I think platform engineering teams can provide basically standard deployments and configurations of like your open telemetry collector, and make that available also to developers for local development, make those configurations standard and available to them. So there's that aspect. And then we can also take it a little bit further, and I guess that's where you get into, teams that are responsible for doing CI/CD. We can look into the observability of our CI/CD pipelines, which is that one's a really interesting area, because we often forget that our CI/CD pipelines, although internal, they are production systems. They're internal production systems, and your live pipeline is it is basically production. And being able to have insights into how your code gets built from when it gets built to like when it gets deployed, having observability of that is so important, because especially like when our pipelines are working, it's great, yay, things are smooth. But then when things start going caca, things slow down, or maybe you think it's working, but because your pipeline is observable, you can look at the telemetry and realize, oh, there's something weird going on. So having that standardization, like the observability of those pipelines, I think is super important. And that one's kind of a tricky one, because I think observability of CI/CD is still fairly nascent. There is a special interest group within OpenTelemetry that is looking at standardizing observability of CI/CD pipelines, focusing on like, what are the OpenTelemetry semantic conventions, like what are the standard attributes that we are going to be using to capture telemetry on our CI/CD pipelines, so we have that further observability and insight into our pipelines.
I'm thinking about, I'm going way back to the beginning of our conversation about how do you get started, and I'm thinking about platform engineering. So I know in other disciplines we've seen, let's just tackle containerization. If you go sort of tackle containerization the way you might try to get that introduced to your organization, you'd find a really good champion group. Maybe there's an application like they're all in. That's how you kind of get started, and then you go out from there. Do you find that there's a similar approach for observability? Is that a similar tactic? If an organization, again, they've said, yeah, let's do this, is that how they get started? They find a champion group to really define what's great?
I think a champion group goes a long way. And even in one of my previous organizations, when I was rolling out like observability practices to the org, if it hadn't been for a couple of like open telemetry enthusiasts, we wouldn't have even gotten nearly as far as we had. So definitely having that kind of grassroots support, the folks who are going to be instrumenting, having that enthusiasm, because it's one thing for like our team to say, yay, observability, yay, OTel. It's another to have a team that's actually using it and say, yes, this thing is legit. But then there's the other side of things, which is that support from up top, right? From executives and from management. And this becomes a little bit tricky as well, because oftentimes, some execs will come in and say, we need to do this observability thing, but it's like, but they're not really sure how to go about it. And so having, I think like having an observability practices team sort of steer them in the right direction and educate them, I think goes a long way. And then having support from managers, because they are managing the individual contributors who are responsible for rolling out observability things, so instrumenting the code and configuring infrastructure related to observability. So having their support, their buy-in, their understanding is super important. So there's like a huge amount of education and internal advocacy, and that's something that we had to do in my previous organization, is like really focus on that internal advocacy. And for us at the time, for example, I was championing open telemetry. I think it was back in 2021, and traces hadn't even made it to GA. And so the entire organization was like, you're telling me to instrument my code with open telemetry and traces haven't even gone to GA. What the hell? And my thought at the time was like, this is going to be big. You need to be patient. And one of the things that I did to sort of help to quell people's concerns was I got basically 2 folks in OpenTelemetry leadership at the time to come in, and they were from competing companies, from competing observability companies. But this speaks to I would say the power of the OpenTelemetry community, is that they were there on behalf of OpenTelemetry, not on behalf of their respective organizations. We weren't even using their product, either of their products, but they were there as a unified front to talk about OpenTelemetry, and they came in for a Q&A on OpenTelemetry. And it was funny because I remember telling my observability practices team, I'm like, oh my God, what if nobody asks questions and we have them for an hour? Let's maybe like pad some questions just in case, because I don't know how people are going to react. And we didn't even have to crack open any of our questions, because the developers were full of questions. It was a really engaging session. And at the end of the day, everyone's feeling a lot better about using OpenTelemetry as a result. So really having that external, that conversation with external people. So it's like, don't take our word for it. Talk to other people who are out there doing it. I think that that's really important as well, like really showing people how OpenTelemetry is used in the wild. That's actually one of the things that I do. I'm one of the maintainers of the OTel end user SIG, and we basically bridge the gap between end users and maintainers, but we also connect end users with each other. And one of the things that we do is share end user stories so that other OTel end users, whether they've been around for a while or they're just getting started, they can hear how it is that people use open telemetry out in the wild. So then they can be like, okay, this thing's doable. I feel good. It gives them a sense of confidence, a sense of community as well.
I have a couple of kind of closing thoughts here. And we've been talking for a while. We talked about observability. We've talked about some of the cultural aspects. We've talked about some of the technical challenges. And I kind of love that we haven't mentioned any of the tools. We talked about the OpenTelemetry framework, but it's not a tool. It's a framework. So how do tools like Dynatrace, like at that platform, how does that help observability? I think we should at least touch on that. We like to try to touch on the people. We talked about the process. We talked a little bit about the tooling. So how does a platform like Dynatrace come in, and how does it help facilitate observability?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for starters, I'm going to actually give you a definition of observability because I think it'll be very helpful in helping to explain this. So the definition of observability that I like, which I give total credit to Hazel Weekly because she came up with this definition, and it's the ability to ask meaningful questions, get useful answers, and then act upon what you've learned. And I think this definition is really important to answering your question, because at the end of the day, especially with something like OpenTelemetry, which is basically used for generating the data for instrumenting, it's for ingesting and capturing the data, I guess, that you're instrumenting, that the data has to go somewhere, right? And that somewhere is going to be an observability backend like Dynatrace. And the interesting thing about the observability landscape is that there are many tools out there. Some tools have been around since like before observability, and they were monitoring tools that have pivoted into observability. There are tools that are good for just one thing, like Jaeger, for example, open source. It is just for ingesting traces. Prometheus, as we know, like it's for storing metrics. And then you get tools that are like unified observability tools like Dynatrace that can ingest like the main open telemetry signals, like so the traces, the logs, and the metrics. And I'd say that having a tool like Dynatrace that provides you with unified observability is super important, because it's not just a matter, observability is not just a matter of analyzing each signal in isolation. Previously you might have heard of like the 3 pillars of observability, right? The traces, the logs, the metrics, but they're more like, to borrow a term from my former coworker, Ted Young, it's more of a braid, right? All of these signals are intertwined, and they each play an important part in the observability show, right? And you can't just like do observability with one or the other. And so being able to have a platform like Dynatrace that can ingest all 3 signals to not just ingest, but give you the ability to correlate those signals and see those correlations is really important, because then, you're not just ingesting the data. It's what is Dynatrace doing with your data? Is it allowing you to ask meaningful questions, get useful answers, and act on the data? And I think that's really what differentiates OTel vendors. I would say observability vendors that ingest OTel data. That's what differentiates them from one another, right? So what kinds of patterns can it identify in your data? Whether it's many organizations, many vendors are leveraging AI for that sort of thing, including Dynatrace. What kinds of patterns is it seeing in your data where it can say, hey, you might want to take a look at this. This looks kind of interesting. Maybe this might be a problem. And so I think that's where the tooling comes in. That's where we start to see the power, right, of observability.
Yeah, I completely agree. Adriana, we're just kind of wrapping up here. I wanted to summarize probably my main 2 takeaways from our conversations today. Like I said, we talked about the culture, we talked about the technology, we talked about the tooling. On the tooling front, really what I took from your explanation was really understand the various tools in your ecosystem, understand that there may be some overlap, but the important thing is to have something that's taking all that information and aggregating it, get together, giving it that correlated view. That's important on the tooling front. The technology front, you have to understand kind of what's in your ecosystem, the infrastructure, the platform, what are customers expecting. But probably the most impactful thing was around the culture, the people part, and that you can have observability people and you can have developers, but if they're not talking together, your observability people don't understand what the app is doing, and your application people don't understand what the observability people know. So really it's a matter of getting those cultures meshed together for good success. Anything else you'd like to add there?
I think you've covered it perfectly. I think just a reminder, observability is a team sport. Do not spin up an observability team and hope that your problems are going to magically go away, and don't ask them to instrument your code for you, because that's just not going to work out.
Thanks so much. Adriana, thank you so much for being a guest today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Solving for Change. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcast service and look for our next episode.